For starters, despite the fact that throughout the whole season I've tried really hard to get into the mood and general direction in which the show was going, I have to say this episode is not what I hoped for. Possibly the weakest one so far. I tried to appreciate the good and understand as much as I can. But that being said, this rant will include a lot of things that I'm not happy about. Before any book reader starts watching this episode, it's important to remember, for their own sanity and peace of mind, a couple of things. First, I'm fairly confident in saying that The Eye of the World is very few people's favorite bit of the books. Even Jordan himself wasn't happy with his writing, and if book lovers were in the headspace to critique the books as much as they do the Amazon show, they would find this bit wanting as well. Secondly is the fact that the story has deviated quite a lot from the specifics throughout the season, but with the notable exception of Matt, it has mostly stuck to the broad strokes. So it should be no significant surprise that the last episode does the same. And to be fair, one of the things that stood out to me as most out of place throughout the episode was actually taken word for word out of the books, only here it's in a different context that makes it harder for me to enjoy, though the delivery and the performances were great. I mean, part of Nynaeve and Lan's dialogue at the start of the episode, I coded in the spoiler section of my previous video, but I definitely didn't think we would see it as soon as that. I imagined probably sometime next season, but definitely not the very next episode, let's say a couple of hours after what we saw last week. The conversation where Lan pours his heart out to Nynaeve and in the same breath implies that if she should choose a life that allows her to wed, he's not the guy for her. Strictly speaking, for the show, and giving the necessary consideration to the fact that Lan must have experienced some jarring emotions finding out that Moiraine left without him and how that must have shaken his priorities, I still find there isn't the right kind of groundwork for this conversation. I find it really hard to comment without revealing anything else about the book story, but that's a struggle I'll have to deal with throughout this whole review. The point is, even though we've established that Nynaeve trusts him and Lan cares for her enough to include her and reach out when she's not alright, though to be fair, the Emondfield 5 haven't really been alright ever since they left Two Rivers. But yes, we have that connection, and we have an off-screen traveling with Moiraine when she says Nynaeve spent every night with the warders. That came out wrong. Dining at the warders' fire. And everyone who knows them is teasing them and suggesting stuff about them, and they spend one night together, but the world we're introduced to in the Amazon adaptations actually carries no particular stigma or seriousness connected to sleeping together outside of wedlock. Anyway, I just feel like this conversation came out of nowhere, and in the context of them spending the night before together, it doesn't work for me. After every suggestion, Lan turns down the idea that he might have some feelings for Nynaeve. He plays it cold and uninterested even to her. But apparently he doesn't mind spending the night with her, wants her to stay over, then gushes about how amazing she is, and at the same time makes it very clear that she shouldn't think of him as possible part of her future without providing much of a reason for it. It just looks like very bad mixed signals. And Nynaeve's tracking tip is something that felt out of nowhere as well. It feels unsubstantiated on first watch, and when you think about it, it still does. If it was something to do with the power, Lan wouldn't be able to track it. And if it wasn't anything to do with the power, Lan not noticing for 20 years is kind of ridiculous. And how would Nynaeve know while tracking them who exactly is leaving the trace? Bonus points for taking from her one of the very few personal accomplishments of Emondfield 5. Now, healing. I think its representation has been rather underwhelming throughout the whole season. Moiraine healing Matt is probably the only scene of that sort that feels like there has been some thought put into it, But Egwene bringing someone from what looks like death and with this tiny trickle of light and almost by the way with zero visible effort, it's a rather extreme problem solved with seemingly minimal effort or skill and near non-existent visuals. And the overall visuals and CGI of this episode I think could have been much better given more time to edit or without the circumstances surrounding COVID. But back to the healing. We know at this point in the Amazon show that Nynaeve is much stronger and so far has shown a better ability to apply the power in extreme circumstances. Egwene has minimal training and experience and barely managed to produce a spark of a fireball when both her life and Perrin's life were at stake. At this stage in the books, we know very little about weaving. I guess we can argue that the show wants to keep the mystery and sense of wonder on the same level, but I still wish it didn't look so much like just wishing really hard. In that scene, we don't really see any obvious concentration even. It's just sad equals massive healing achievement. And revealing a bit of the pretty logical mechanics of the power here, the stronger you are, the more of the one power you can handle going through you without being that badly affected, be it through Angreal, Sangreal, or Link, or whatever. And remember, Nynaeve is the healer in essence, and both as the wisdom and in her first obvious attempt at using the power. She is the oldest and has decently represented instinct to keep the kids safe, so her sacrifice makes some sense. But my point is that based both on the available foreshadowing and the very basic mechanics of the power, it made a lot more sense that Nynaeve, being the strongest channeler in the Link, would be the last one to burn out, and possibly the despair and anger would hit her hard enough to heal Egwene back from the brink. It would have been repetitive for the series, I get that, but we have a much better base to believe that. Instead of Egwene, I can't even make fire without Moraine holding my hand, Alvir, curing death with sadness. But I am generally a fan of more structured magic systems, like the ones built by Brandon Sanderson in his own works, which is why only a little further in the Wheel of Time books, when we find out more about the magic system, it gets more interesting to me. At this point, especially in the Amazon series, channeling feels a lot like a very repetitive Deus Ex Machina, the god from the machine that's just there to save everyone when the times are tough. Trollocs attack, Moraine blows them up. Logain kills everybody, Nynaeve heals them. But in this episode, it's brought to a whole new level. What Moraine tells Rand and what we see with Egwene in this scene, it's just, when you need it, it will be there. No matter what you need. Generate enough power to break the unbreakable or cure the incurable. Doesn't matter. If you want it, it will be there. For me, that makes for very unsatisfying solutions to the problems they face. And also 5 women, of whom the leader is one who wasn't strong enough or skilled enough to become a full Aes Sedai, blast away thousands of Trollocs and Fades. I have an issue with the increased damage dealing through channeling at this point in the story, because without that being much of a spoiler, there is a lot more story to tell. And if it builds up from here, it's gonna hit the ceiling pretty soon, and it simply makes everything and everyone else seem irrelevant and dismissible to the problem solving, which is something I see as quite a big issue on the whole. Without specifying, for me one of the most interesting characters in the books are the ones who can't channel, but had the skill set, the tenacity, strategy, or overall character to matter and be important and impactful without channeling. And also some of the best scenes actually have very little to do with magical problem solving, but much more to do with the strength of character. So what I'm trying to say is I really wish that once the show has made its introduction to the new viewers and it has told them in no uncertain terms, if you want flashy magic, we got flashy magic, that maybe now, in the seasons to come, they can focus on the rest as well. But again, this could be just my personal preferences speaking. Some of my all-time favorite book characters are Terry Pratchett's witches, and while they do have some powerful and unspecified magic at their disposal, it's absolutely not key to the characters as they are or to the stories around them. However, ignoring personal preferences and books and focusing simply on what we see in the show, I find it unbalanced that we see 9 full sisters several episodes ago, some of the sisters being the Battle Aja, fight what looks like a handful of soldiers with some effort. And then sometime later we see 5 women with no training or incomplete training utterly destroyed thousands of Trollocs. I get that it's because in the first case there's a limited budget for actual actors or stuntmen running through the forest, and in the second case it's a poorly generated mass of CGI monsters, but I wish I didn't have to make those excuses. And strategically, since the one power is basically a ranged weapon, the women standing in the middle of nowhere with no cover seems like a poor decision, having a fortress or at least rocks available. Channelers are not immortal, an arrow can kill them as well as anybody, and where would we be then? And talking about strategy, here's something else. I've always liked that in Jordan's works, while there is a certain separation and distribution of tasks between men and women, when it came to war, especially in the less sheltered cultures, but even in the two rivers, women could fight side by side with men if they wanted to. I was kind of disappointed to see in the Borderlands of all places Agiomar ordering his sister to stay back and organize the evacuation. It gave me major Theoden and Theowen vibes, which doesn't feel like the way of the Wheel of Time. In other aspects, I'm curious about the argument they had about the armor. I'd love to see Agiomar survive despite the monstrous hit he took. I like to entertain the thought that perhaps there was a reason why he didn't wear his ancestral armor, like say a prophecy that the next Jagad to wear it would die wearing it or something, so that it makes sense and it's not just that the showrunners wanted to give Amalisa the flashier armor just like they gave her and her barely trained women the victory, while the men who are supposed to be one of the best fighters and definitely the best prepared to fight Trollocs die in a rather inglorious way. Also, isn't it marvelous that in a city of thousands, the only 3 channelers included a Malkieri woman for bonus hurt points? And I'm aware that time and budget constraints come into the equation, but a place like Tarwin's Gap, blocked by a defense wall of that sort, with only narrow slits for archers, it looks to me, excuse the yet another Lord of the Rings comparison, but defendable on par with the outer wall of Helm's Deep, or better, and especially against a foe that we don't see using any kind of siege weaponry. We don't even see them try to break a door or something, they just jump through the embrasures and they seem to overcome the defenders like they're nothing. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that point. I love learning new stuff about military tactics and strategies, but moving on from that and from me wishing that the women were on the same wall so that thousands of men didn't have to die in order to provide the women with a more dramatic victory. Moving on. One of the book cloak annoyances I have is in regards to Agiomar saying, "May the last embrace of the mother welcome you home." looking directly at the Trolloc Horde and addressing nobody else. That, my non-reader friends, is a sort of blessing that Shannarans say when they bury their own, without a coffin or a shroud, and that's what they call the last embrace of the mother. To see it spoken to a horde of Trollocs in all seriousness, without sarcasm or a sharp threat, it makes me want to scratch my eyes out. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but for a Borderlander to say that to a Trolloc horde feels to me like blasphemy. Right, now moving on to Rand and Moiraine. The blight around them feels a bit passively portrayed. We see the damage it has done to others, but it doesn't threaten our guys in any way. But that's alright, the time limit's considered. More time for mind games with the dark guy, which is alright by me. There are some iffy graphics here, but all in all he is properly malevolent and intimidating. Rand defeating him just like that is something that again felt unsatisfying, but at least he sort of earns it by overcoming the temptation to get the life he wanted. And the dark guy expression at the end hints that maybe something else entirely happened here. Rand's decision to go off alone and protect others from his impending madness fits him nicely as a character, but I still struggle with the idea that Moiraine would allow him to go in the middle of the Blight, after establishing that she would die to protect all of them and she would kill them before letting them turn to the shadow. Even if at that point she still thinks that it's all over. And Perry's story in this episode, I kind of think it wasn't even meant for him. I realized that in his core he is an unobtrusive person and not one to place any particular importance on himself, but still the most active and impactful thing he does throughout the whole season is kill his wife in episode 1, and the rest of the time he talks, supports other characters and suffers a lot. He's not the one to incapacitate Valda, and he's not the one to fight Padan Fain now. It's fair enough, of course, if the show is to be respectful to the trauma they inflicted on him. It would cast a long shadow and cripple him for a long time to come, but he feels on the whole rather underdeveloped as a character. The mysterious fleet arriving at the end, raising a tsunami against a random cliffside with a single girl on it, errs on the side of being overly dramatic. It introduces them as a seemingly pointlessly destructive, malevolent force. I didn't like them much in the books, and with some exceptions, I am looking forward to seeing a new read on them. But so far, I can't say I'm particularly pleasantly surprised. They are intimidating for sure, and the detail with the birds fleeing before they come is very nice. The ship's design felt very different from what I had in my mind's eye for them. I thought they would lean more towards a cleaner, uncluttered style. I imagined it designed after some Chinese or Japanese influences. I think some of that can be seen in the armor and costumes, but the face paint and metal mouth gags are something else entirely. And if Conan the Barbarian was a ship, he would be one of those ships. So yeah, it's very far from the picture in my mind's eye, but I realize this is very personal, and the showrunners have modeled the Borderlanders after certain Asian cultures, so it's important to show the invaders as something entirely different and distinctive. Now, spoilers. There are many changes in this episode, but I think some of them are fairly easy to swallow. There is some sense of wonder in looking for the place that travels around with the Green Man, and never in the same spot, never found twice. And the Green Man himself is a sweet trope, especially for nature lovers. But is he essential to the plot? No, he's not. but I feel a bit robbed on behalf of Nynaeve with regards to both her romantic story and her own personal arc. She has apparently lost her ability to listen to the wind, which is not the case in the books at all, and doesn't seem to have her struggle accepting and managing channeling at will. Though I will admit that without her inner monologue, it would be hard to show the anger trigger and how she works herself to work around it. If we are willing to go out of her way to justify the show or imagine ways that it can go back to the original story, the trauma of burning out could be used to introduce the block, but again, I think that's a change that I think affects the essence and the inner motivation of the characters. It's a much deeper change than simply what happens or what they do. And on top of that, healing, which was her superpower, we've actually seen almost every other channeler do that as well. And in the books it made sense that she would be so good at it instinctively without anyone teaching her. But we had her background in using the power for that particular purpose even without knowing it. So even though extreme, the scene with Nynaeve bursting into light and healing everybody made some sense. Egwene's miraculous healing is quite a bit iffier on the believability scale. Regarding the Horn of Valere part of the story, I don't really have an issue with it being found like this. My guess is that Woyao would be stabbed with the ruby dagger and will live through it, given the fact that Matt stayed in Tar Valon. If Woyao survives that wound, it would justify him having a connection to the dagger and will be able to track the dagger instead of Matt. I've said it before and I'll probably say it again in the overall review for the season when I make it, if I make it. But I'm generally annoyed at how most of the characters don't really do much. By the same point in the books, we see them being good at something at least, even if it's something as little as Rand and Matt actually learning a skill from Tom, or any of the boys training with Lan and him reminding them that the skills they have from hunting are absolutely applicable in combat. I gather it's important to show them as unprepared, but for me what happens is they seem most of the time inept, and when they do something it's an unexplained, unearned win through some sort of special powers. My hopes are still that now that the trouble of introducing so much in season 1 is over, the next season will have a better footing and work better. There are rumors that it will start early next year, and while I am impatient to see it, I would prefer it if they delay it a little bit so that it's not such a compromise on the editing and CGI as we see in this episode. Hope for the best, guys!